I'm Jonathan Allen. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Innovation Programs at the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship. I'm here to present to you today a PowerPoint on UX behavior design, and this is obviously for the UChicago Mobile App Challenge this year. To begin, I just kind of want to equate apps with tools. Really what you're building, if you're building an app, is you're building some kind of a tool that people will use. And I'll just illustrate that in a pretty simple way. Tools are what people use. And if you think about two users who see a problem, so this might be a problem or an opportunity or need. In this case, it's a leaky pipe. There's some type of motivation. So something clicks with them that this needs to be addressed. It's a motivating cause or a motivating need. And that motivation should cause some kind of trigger. And that trigger will make them think of something, some kind of ability. So whether that be to go get a tool, and they have the ability to fix it, or call someone who can fix it. And that ability, in theory, addresses the need or the opportunity that they're trying to address. So when you're doing a mobile app, you're kind of thinking about it in the same way, where you have a tool, which is your ability, or this app that you're going to have, that addresses some kind of need. And that's the question mark element of this. So thinking about it that way, what puts the challenge into the app challenge? I think that's a big question that we could address in some dorky way. It's not just doing this. It's not just addressing the user interface. And by interface, that's actually when you open the app and you go through the pages of an app to when you close it. That's usually what we think about when we think about making a mobile app. It's much broader than that. And what the presentation here today is supposed to talk about is this whole user experience. And so not just when you use the app, but the whole broad view of what's the app in context to the life or what you're doing in life, and how does it actually play a role in it. So we can look at this as a whole spectrum of when you develop a mobile app, what are the elements that you're looking at? And so we think about going through this process of research, design, front end and back end. And these are all different parts of the design process. And the first part that we're going to talk about today is the user experience design. And so thinking about that first half, that influence and affects how you design an interface, and then obviously the back end and how those all work together. And so in this presentation, we're really going to think about some research tools or some ways to think about how to better do user experience design and think about that element of it. So the 4 points we're going to talk about is context, motivation, ability, and triggers, and how these all work together. So there's a professor named B.J. Fogg out of Stanford who does a really great job of wrapping these all together and explaining how they work. So we'll get to that at the end. So the first thing we'll talk about is context. And we'll put that in the frame of a user journey. And so a user journey, and these are just a couple of illustrations. You don't have to digest these graphics. It's two different examples of what a user journey can look like. But user journey allows you to think about the context of the user and what's around them, what's going on in their environment, what are the external factors that influence them. The journey also just takes you through the step-by-step process of what's going on and the whole experience of their life and how the app plays into that. Different interactions, who do they interact with, objects that they might interact with, like devices, and emotions. So what are their emotions along this whole process? This is obviously just kind of a quick overview. I'm going to give you an example of how you can use a user journey. But if you go to Pinterest, there's actually a really great index of different user journeys you can take a look at. And then there's a book called 101 Design Methods by Vijay Kumar out of IIT's Institute of Design that really breaks down how you think about user journeys. But I'll give you an example of an app that I came up with while doing this presentation, which is a pretty stupid app. But I was just running late to a dinner, and I wanted to inform someone that I was going to be running late. And I thought, well, why can't we just send them something that lets them track as we go? There's a lot of great ways for me as a user to follow how long it takes me to get somewhere, but how do you let someone else know? And so this is a simple idea. It's not much. There's priority solutions to it, but we'll just use it as an example for this app. So this is usually how we think about apps. When we think about the time when we actually are using the app. So if you think about going to dinner and meeting someone, this is when I get in the car to when I arrive at the restaurant. And that's usually how we think that the app will be used. Now, you can think a little bit more broadly about when it potentially might be used as well. So, even if I'm preparing to go to dinner or get in the car, that might be a time where this clicks in where I might need to use this app. Or even if I'm maybe going out to dinner with my parents, they want to know if I get home safe afterwards. That's another time that you could potentially use this app. And then obviously, the times when you're not using the app. So that's maybe when you first scheduled it. And this is that whole user experience. So there's obviously a lot more things going on in your life, but thinking about between the time of when you scheduled dinner when you actually show up at dinner and you're not actually using the app till later in the night. So they're all factors that play a role. And obviously thinking about the receiver of the message that you want to send, that they're going to be using an app or using some kind of interaction as well. So you have to think about these things in tandem. So now using this kind of user journey, you can actually start looking at these three other elements I'm going to talk about. So motivation is actually a really important part of this. And I'm going to talk about motivation waves and a little bit of how that's important. But the big question is, who's most motivated to use your app? And there's a lot of things in this that we typically think about in terms of the type of people who are most motivated. In your applications, you guys have all demonstrated you have some awareness or some knowledge of who you really think would be the target user for this. It might be a student, it might be a physician, it might be a combination of those people. And we're really good at actually making these profiles. So there's personas, you can do segmentation so you really understand, its age or gender or some type of description of how you'd think about these people, and then who would be the early adopters of this app. It's really hard to position an app as everyone's going to use this. You really have to start focusing on, well, who really needs this? And that's an important element. There's a lot of different tools within these, but what I really actually want you to focus on in this, especially with the app design and think about the user experience, is that motivations vary. There are things called motivation waves, and so motivations can vary based on whatever you're going to do. So there's checking email. You have motivation at different points, going to the bathroom, paying taxes. These all come in at different points. And you're obviously not always motivated to do all these things. You're not constantly going to the bathroom or constantly needing to go to the bathroom, right? It's a pretty straightforward concept, but sometimes you forget the fact that highly motivated people, if you've targeted them, you really actually have to understand the nuance of motivation in their life. So another important point to this is actually that there's a lot of different motivations going on in people's lives. So motivation changes on a minute, daily, hour, year basis. And you have to think about what are the other things going on in their lives that you're competing against when it comes to motivation. So here in the example I was just giving, I can think about when motivation really plays a role and when it waves and when it increases and decreases. So if you think about this whole process of, obviously I'm not using the app, so I'm not very motivated when I just scheduled dinner, to the points where I'm leaving in the car where I'm highly motivated, that I really want someone to be using this or receiving this on the other end. And then when I get to dinner, there's not a lot of utility, so it drops off, right? So it's a really great way to start just mapping out what you think the motivations are. And obviously on the receiver end, it's important to think about that as well. And then motivations themselves, they can vary on a scale. So motivating factors can be something that's pleasurable. So maybe you're increasing pleasure of something, or pain on the other side. Maybe you're decreasing some kind of pain that they have. Hope and fear, acceptance, rejection. These are just examples or categories so you can think about the ways that people are motivated. The third thing is ability factors. Thinking about the ability that people have to do whatever it is that you want them to do. There's a lot of abilities that you can influence, and so these examples are, you can save someone time, you can save someone or make someone money, you can save them mental effort or physical effort, so making it easier for them to do something or make it fewer steps to accomplish something. There are two other social deviants and non-routine. We won't get into examples of that today, but also ability factors that you can influence. And they all kind of live on the scale of how do you make things easier for people, or how do you simplify things? And that's really a goal of a lot of apps, is to put simplicity into people's lives. So just a quick example of this, of Instagram. Instagram's a great example of a company that put together a couple of these key things. Instagram did a great job of saving people time, mental effort, physical effort, by combining things like taking a picture, filtering it, and sharing it with friends. It's a really great example of how do you combine a couple of these things. But the important part is not thinking about them as features, but remembering what the core of it is that's the value proposition for the user. A lot of people, especially who go through this competition, do a lot of feature creep. And so what are all the things that my app can do? It can get really clouded, and you really lose focus of what the value is that people describe the value of your app. This app helps me do X, and that's how they sell it to their friends, and that's the way you have to think about framing the discussion to some degree, or how you're going to frame your app in general. BJ Fogg, who we'll get to, he has a great website. He has actually a lot of great things online. His big focus on this is simplicity, and if you go to his website, he explains all these different models, but really particularly focusing on the simple behavior. So I highly recommend you guys check that out. So you have to think about, when I'm designing something for this need, what are the workarounds, or what are the ways that people can already do this? So if you think about the ways when I'm running late to dinner, I can call them. I can just tell them I'm running late. I could text message them. I could use the Find Friends app that Apple developed. Or I could do nothing. And it's important to know these are all ability factors, and there's different motivations for wanting to do this. You just need to recognize in context of what are you competing against. You usually think, oh, what are the other apps in the App Store? But there's also other things that people use to either, and maybe they're not even motivated to use a device or a tool. They have other ways or workarounds for it. So you need to understand the context with which you're working in terms of competition. This plays a factor that maybe people don't even want your app. And that's a real question that you're going to have to address. And this is kind of the example. You can make free apps that might not make any money, but recognize the fact that it's still going to cost you something to have the app running. So the cost to make and sell and deliver some app has to be less than or equal to the price, which has to be less than or equal to the perceived value, right? It's a really important equation. We don't have to dive deep in this because this is not about the business model of apps. But do recognize that this whole process of user experience or user research in this manner really helps you start exploring where there's need and what people are willing to pay for and use. The last thing in these categories is triggers, and that's the real call to action. So you have to think about what triggers a behavior that you're looking for. So a trigger is a call to action, a prompt, or a cue. It's a mechanism that lets people act, or it causes them to act. And so your goal is if this, then that, to have them do something. This happens, so then they do that, right? So the trigger is this, the this part of if this, then that, and the action is the that, right? It's kind of a word mess, but you get the general idea. So examples of triggers. Well, there's a lot of triggers that we have in our life. The ones that you might recognize right away are different cues. So cues might be you get a message on your phone that you have a friend request or something along those lines. It cues you to go and check and see who asked you, post a picture of you online. A cycle thing is something that you do on a regular basis. So you think about a pill holder. I don't know what they're called. But that's a repeated thing, and that cues you. So that'd be your trigger to take a pill for that day. And then the echoing behavior is actually something that you can hook them once. So this is an AT&T bill, and then you're on a subscription, and it actually just keeps going. You don't even actually have to pay attention to it. You just have to do a one-time behavior, and then it's repeated over time. And so these are different triggers, and they all can be designed into whatever you're doing to some degree. But you have to think about when you should trigger. And so the key is to put hot triggers in front of highly motivated people. And remember, highly motivated people depends on the motivation cycle that they're on. So if you think about this graphic again of my user journey for my app, I'm putting little stars here on where I think are potential trigger points of when I want something to happen, okay? So for this case, there's trigger points of when I'm highly motivated, when I'm going on my travels, what's going to trigger me to actually have them look at this app? Likewise, if I'm telling someone else to follow along with me on where I am on my journey, there needs to be a trigger for them. And you have to think about the barriers that go into this. Do they need to have an app themselves in order to access the information? Is there a way you can make that simpler than just text messaging, sending an email, or calling, or doing nothing? A really great example of this is actually Google. Google's done a really wonderful job with their I think these are called pages or cards, that are very tied into your calendar and other things in your email that actually prompt you about how long your commute is going to be when you go to work in the morning, because it knows where you are. It knows the weather around you. If you have a flight, it can tell you what your flight estimate or time is. It's extraordinarily useful in the sense that it's really sensitive to when you're motivated to get something. There's plenty of apps that send you notifications when you don't need it or don't want it, and that's a problem. And you don't want to design around bad apps like that. You really want to be thoughtful about these elements. So to wrap this part up, or pull all these key things, key elements in user research, BJ Fogg really does a nice job in his behavior model, and there's a lot of stuff. This is just kind of an iceberg the tip of the iceberg of what he teaches at Stanford in general. But he has this thing called the behavior model. And so on the y-axis here, you have motivation. If people are highly motivated up on the top, and then you have low motivation on the bottom. And on the x-axis, you have ability, so something that's really hard to do versus something that's really easy to do. And he has this thing called an activation threshold. So if you look at motivation, here's an example of something you might be highly motivated to do, but you're not doing because it's really hard, is to stop smoking, right? And so here are the areas which you can help people move down this line of how do you make it easier. So if you're moving along the x-axis, how do you help them quit smoking? So you might save them physical effort, mental effort, or time. There's a lot of factors you can influence. Likewise, waking up in the morning. Obviously, it's really easy to wake up in the morning, but motivation might be the issue, right? And so there's different things that you could do to motivate you to wake up in the morning. Alarm clock being annoying in the morning is a painful motivation to get out of bed, right? The important thing to recognize is that ability is actually the more important, not the more important, but the easier one to influence than motivation, especially over time. I'm going to give you an example of how that works. So I'm sure maybe many of you have made the goal of working out 30 minutes a day. It's a pretty common goal for a lot of us, especially around this time of year. And after a period of time, when you try and stay motivated on that, when you have finals come up or you might have a party you have to go to, you might drop off and your motivation decreases. And so that goal of trying to go 30 minutes every day doesn't get accomplished. So what BJ Fogg really focuses on is actually don't worry about trying to you should go after highly motivated people, but make it really easy for them so that even when the motivation is really low, they'll still do some good behavior, especially if you're going from 0 to 60. You should really go from 0 to 1 when you're starting a new behavior. So in this case, if you don't work out at all, the recommendation is just to put on gym shoes, which I think is a pretty brilliant one. For me, my option was Fitbit. Fitbit's a really great device that you can actually track your steps. You should check them out if you haven't. It's a really cool connection between motivation, connecting you socially with other people. It's a great example of how you can actually do a small behavior and influence people to get them to work out more and be more active. So in summary, these are kind of the key things for user research that I'll really stress that you guys focus on. So really thinking about the context and thinking about this whole user journey of someone's experience and thinking about how it relates to other people that they're interacting with. So obviously, if you're in a space like healthcare, you're doing an app in those spaces, recognize there's probably a lot of stakeholders you're thinking about. And so you have to think about all these other elements of motivation, ability, and a trigger, and how do they work with other people? When are they motivated? And if they're not motivated, how do you make it really easy for them to do whatever it is? So I highly recommend you check out BJ Fogg. He's got some great material on this content. But this is a great first start for you guys just to check out and get started on your journey of making an app. So thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the classroom.